Hi, my name is Lily and welcome back to my channel and welcome to my August and Pixarathon wrap-up. So, if you didn't know, in August I hosted the readathon Pixarathon, which was a Pixar themed readathon. You could choose all sorts of different routes to go down and I chose... Oh, if you heard that, that's my dog groaning because he's tired. I chose to go down the adventure route, which involved reading 6 books, and then there was also a book that was the route prompt, which I doubled up with one of the regular prompts for the route. In total, I read 12 books and DNF'd 1 book, and I'll be talking to you about pretty much all of them, I think, and I included all 12 in my Pixarathon, but the DNF I didn't. So my route prompt was to read a book featuring a quest or an adventure, and the first prompt in the route was Nemo, read a book you forgot about, and for both of those I read Fireborn by Aisling Fowler. This is a review copy because I took part in the blog tour. You can go and check out my full review over on Bookstagram if you want to. But yes, I read Fireborn by Aisling Fowler. This is a middle grade fantasy. It's about a girl named 12 who is at this camp, basically, that is in the centre of this world, and around the camp are all of these different tribes that live in different areas of the world, and they don't all necessarily get along, and these people in the middle of this camp, I think they're called hunters. It is their role to make sure that monsters don't kill everybody in this world, and also to try and help negotiate between the different clans. And 12 has given up her past to join the hunters, but there's definitely something else going on, and that's basically the premise of this book. I really enjoyed this one. It was a really solid middle grade fantasy for me. I gave it 3 stars because I found it really enjoyable to read and I think it's a really good first book. However, there were 2 things that I didn't like about it. The first one was that I thought there was too much action and not enough anything else. There wasn't a lot of character development going on, there wasn't a lot of talking, it was just a lot of action, 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 and I've never really been a big fan of books that are action scene after action scene. But if you like a really, really fast-paced, heavy action book, then this is definitely going to be more for you. The other thing that I didn't like about it was that I thought that the characters were really unlikable and they don't really get like redeemed or have any character development until like the very, very end of the book. So I spent a lot of the time not liking any of the characters or the decisions that they made. But what I think was really strong about this book is that it's very, very unique. I really loved the world that was created and the adventure that these kids go on, and I also really liked the magical creatures that were involved. It was a lot more like fairies and that kind of, I guess, European folklore kind of fairies rather than things like dragons, and I thought that was really good because you don't get to see that a lot in fantasy in general, and I thought it was really unique and really well done. So yeah, I think it's a solid 3 stars. It's one that I definitely recommend to anyone who is a lover of middle grade fantasy and anyone who likes action-packed books. It just wasn't amazing for me, which is why it didn't get too high a rating, but I don't think it's a bad book at all. The next movie was WALL-E, and to read a book that had sci-fi elements, so I read Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. Now this I thought would be more sci-fi than it was because the premise is really, really confusing and hard to explain, but this is an adult horror and kind of literary fiction at the same time. It definitely has a lot of horror elements to it, but it's not written in the style of like a traditional Stephen King horror. It definitely feels like a blend of literary fiction and horror. I would also say if you have any major trigger warnings that you should look them up for this book. I won't be explaining the trigger warnings in the video because if you can go in and you don't have any triggers and you can read it completely not knowing what's coming, it really adds to the effect of the book. But if you do have triggers, I will make sure I put the link for the Book Trigger Warnings website down below because this book has a lot of them and they're quite serious triggers, and it is very graphic in all of the triggers that are mentioned, so just be careful going into it. But basically, this book is about a young girl that I've forgotten the name of because I read it at the beginning of the month, Natsuki. It's about a young girl named Natsuki who feels like she doesn't fit into the world. She believes that her little toy hedgehog is an alien from another planet and that her cousin is also an alien from this planet. And basically, it's a story about what happens when you don't fit into the world. It's a commentary on capitalism, on sexism, on the role of women and on society, and it's very, very speculative, and it's kind of a story of what happens if, of course my dog chooses now to play with a squeaky toy. It's a story that very much looks at what would happen if someone has these obsessive thoughts and wants to reject society. It's really hard to explain anything else without giving it away because not a lot happens in this book. It's definitely a very speculative and literary fiction style book with horror elements, but I would highly recommend it if you can handle it because it was an incredible reading experience. Sayaka Murata has this way of writing that completely explains the reason people do things and makes it seem reasonable without you actually condoning the things that happen in the book. So yeah, it's an incredible reading experience if you can handle it. The next movie for my route was Up, and for that one I needed to read a book that had an elderly main character. I decided to read a comic book / graphic novel called Lugosi. This is a biography of the actor Lugosi, who was the very first person to play Dracula on a big screen film. He was known for playing Dracula on the stage beforehand, which is how he got the role, and it tells the story of his rise to fame right from when he was a child and wanting to go into acting all the way up until his peak and what happened to him afterwards. It's about drug addiction, it's about faithfulness and marriage and loss and divorce. It's a lot. The book is a lot. I think I gave it 4 stars, and that's because I thought it was an amazing biography. I didn't know anything about Lugosi. I'd never heard of him before because I'm not a fan of those kinds of films. I'm not a fan of horror films in that sense, and I'm not a fan of classical movies. So I didn't know who Lugosi was, and I found this book incredibly accessible. And if you really want to learn about the history of Hollywood, how people were treated, and specifically about how Lugosi was treated and what happened to him, it's a really good read. It is just fascinating, and it's done in a way that's very sensitive because Lugosi isn't an amazing person, and this book doesn't try to make it out like he was always the victim. It doesn't make him seem like he was completely bad and he deserved everything that he got, but it's a very balanced story of his life, saying yes, people mistreated him, but he also mistreated other people, and this is kind of how he managed his fame and mismanaged his fame, and it was a really great read. I would highly recommend it. The next movie was The Good Dinosaur, and for that one I needed to read a book that had a coming of age story to it, so I read The Keeper of the Little Folk, which is another comic book. This was a lot shorter than all the others, and honestly if it wasn't as short as it was I would have DNF'd it. I only gave it 2 stars, and this one is gonna sound like a rip-off of the Spiderwick Chronicles because it kind of is. It's about a young girl who her grandmother ends up in hospital. I think she broke her leg, and when she goes to visit her she takes her some flowers from her garden, and her grandmother says that one of these flowers is an SOS signal from the little folk who live in their garden. And basically it turns out that her grandmother was the keeper of the little folk, which is like fairies and stuff, and that she now needs the granddaughter to take over looking after them. The granddaughter kind of has to solve why there's this SOS signal, which is because some creature that lives in the lake has gone missing, I think. It just wasn't amazing. What was really sad is the art was incredible. I thought it was really well drawn, the colours were amazing, there was a really strong colour palette throughout, the characters were designed really well. You could really see their characters and which ones were cheeky, which ones were mean, all through their character design. I thought that was done amazingly. The artist should be proud of themselves for that work, but unfortunately the story just wasn't there. It was very clearly a bit of a copy of Spiderwick Chronicles, and the plot just was not well paced at all. Everything just happened and nothing, there was no build up, there was no tension, there was no getting to know the characters. This book, I think if it had been quadruple the length, because it was only about 60 pages long, if it had been 250 pages, which is not huge for a graphic novel, then I feel like it would have been a really great story, and there would have been time to develop characters, to introduce the world a bit more, to add a bit more depth to the story, and to work on the pacing. It would have been really improved. But yeah, it is one of those books that just needs a lot more work than it had. The next movie was Coco, and for that one I needed to read a book featuring music or musicians, so I read Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So I have had this on my TBR since it first came out back in 2018 or 2019 I think, and I just haven't read it. And I picked it up in Tesco because it was a cheap hardback in there, and I thought it sounded cool, and I just haven't read it until now. This is a adult, I don't know, it's kind of historical fiction technically now because it was set 50 years ago, but not really. It's hard to explain, but basically This is told in an interview format, and it's about the band Daisy Jones and the Six. So the Six was a band that started independently, and Daisy Jones was a solo artist, and then they had the same like record company, I think, and the record company suggested that they work together on a single, and that single goes so well that Daisy joins the band. And it's about what happens when Daisy joins the band, and you're told in the blurb that the band has this meteoric rise to fame and suddenly breaks up. And this book is an interview about what happened, how did they get so famous, and why did they suddenly break up without any warning. And it's incredible. I gave it 5 stars. I have also heard that the audiobook for this is really good because apparently it's got a full cast and it's just really well acted, and that sounds amazing. So if you're an audiobook lover, this is one you should definitely be checking out on audiobook. And yeah, there's not much I can say about it without giving any spoilers, but this book is incredibly emotional in a way that, like, not a lot of truly sad things happen in this book, but just the build up of the tension is incredible, and it just makes you feel very emotional by the end of the book. I also liked how they dealt with the topics of drug abuse and adultery and all that kind of stuff, where it was explained that it happened and that it was quite normal back in the time because this is set in the 1970s, but also how it still wasn't okay that it was normal, because you have various characters who are drug users, who are addicted to drugs, you have characters who are cheating, all those kinds of things. So again, another one to look up triggers for. And it portrays it in a very matter-of-fact way of this is how it was back then, but it really negatively impacted us. So it doesn't glamorize that rock and roll lifestyle in the way that other books do, where they say like, oh, it's so cool, they did cocaine all the time. This book was like, yeah, we did cocaine all the time, but it really affected us in these negative ways as well as the positive ways. So I thought that was a really well balanced aspect of it. I also found it really interesting that, like, I didn't like most of the characters in this book. Most of the people in this book are not good people, or they're very morally grey people, I should say. They're just not perfect people. And I still cared about them, and I still believed them, and they felt very real, and it just, yeah, it's just so well written. This is making me want to pick up another Taylor Jenkins Reid book really soon. And the final book on my route was Onward, and that was to read a book that featured a mystery or a puzzle, and for that I read Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J Maas. I didn't read this copy, this is just the closest copy, and I was too lazy to get anything else. I listened to the audiobook because I am rereading the whole ACOTAR series so that I can read A Court of Silver Flames, because I want to be able to remember what happened in the previous books. So I gave this one 5 stars as a pure nostalgia rating. If you're wondering where the mystery element comes into it, I would say the mystery of why the Spring Court are wearing the masks is a mystery in itself, but also there's like a riddle at one point in the book, and so it counts. It counts, okay? I've decided it counts. This was a pure nostalgia 5-star rating. It's not actually a 5-star book, like, objectively, but for me it was amazing. I haven't read this since I was 16 and I really enjoyed it. It's nice reading it knowing what happens next, because I can see now why I rated it 4 stars, because I didn't really like certain characters and certain pairings in this book, and things are explained later on in the books as to why you're not actually supposed to like them. So yeah, if you're looking to read ACOTAR, I would recommend it. So those are all of the prompts on my route. I also read some extra books that are for just any of the other movies in Pixar, so I will tell you them just in the order that I've listed them. I think it is movie release order. So the first non-route prompt was for Toy Story, and that was to read a book that had a disabled main character. I read With You Forever by Chloe Leese. This is the 4th book, I want to say, in the Bergman Brothers series, and I loved it so much. It is my new favourite Bergman Brothers book, and it is one of my all-time favourites now. It's one that I'm definitely going to be getting my own physical copy of. Oh, I loved it. I loved it so much. I should say again, this is another ARC, another review copy, but this is a completely honest review. I loved it. I really loved it, and it's hard to explain it again without spoilers, so I'm going to try and think really hard about this. But basically this is about the oldest Bergman brother, I think, called Axel. Axel is autistic, and he is living in this cabin in the woods near the family's like vacation cabin. And he discovers that the vacation cabin needs an awful lot of work, like hundreds of thousands of dollars level of work to it for it to be habitable. But he doesn't have the money, but he can get some money from an inheritance pot. But to get this inheritance, he needs to be married, and he is not. And he is kind of under the belief that he will never be married, so he has kind of dismissed that money. But he now needs it. And then the other person you have is Rooney. I think Rooney is the character. I want to say it is. Who is the best friend of the female main character in the first book. She has a chronic illness. I can't remember which particular diagnosis it is, but it's one of the irritable bowel diseases, which means that she has flare-ups, and at the moment she's having a huge flare-up and has had to take a leave of absence from university because she's going there for law school. And so she wants to have a getaway, and her friend from the first book tells her that she can go and stay at the family cabin as a little getaway because no one else is supposed to be there, except someone is supposed to be there, and it's Axel. And when she gets there, she discovers that it is uninhabitable, as Axel has discovered. So Axel offers to let her stay at his house so that she can still have this getaway, and they end up agreeing to have a marriage of convenience so that Axel can get the money to do up the A-frame. And oh, it's so cute. It's so cute. Axel is like my dream. He's just perfect. Like, I feel like Chloe Lease wrote him for me. He wears glasses. He's tall, and he has brown hair, and he's creative, and he lives in a cabin in the woods. I want him. I know I have a boyfriend, but I said it. And then Rooney is just a really lovely character. She's not perfect, but she's still lovely and sweet. And I just thought it was a really wholesome book where they both learn that their disabilities and chronic illnesses aren't everything there is to know about them, and that they are still worthy even though they have them. And it just... it's just so lovely. I love this so much. It's such a good adult romance. It is steamy, but it wasn't one of those books where it's all about the steam. There was a lot of emotions in there as well, and I really, really loved it. Next was Monsters Inc., a book that will make you laugh, and I read The Adventure Zone, The Crystal Kingdom. This is the fourth one in the Adventure Zone graphic novel adaptations. So these are based on the podcast by the same name, which is hosted by the McElroy brothers and their dad. And in the podcast they are playing D&D, with one of the brothers being the game master, and then the other two brothers and the dad playing D&D characters. And it's great. I've never actually listened to the podcast. I've only read the graphic novels, and I adore them. They are my favourite graphic novel series. So of course I was really excited when this came out. And what I love about it is none of them really know what they're doing. They mess up a lot, and they just kind of go with the flow, and it's very chaotic, and that is exactly how I am when I play these kinds of games. So it doesn't feel like I have to really understand D&D to read it. I just get to vibe and have fun with them. So yeah, I really, really love these series. This one is, because they're all kind of independent, you do need to know previous books' plots to understand what exactly is going on here, but it's not a spoiler to tell you like the premise of this book for the other books. But basically this one is about they need to go to a lab because something is causing this whole lab to turn into crystal, and if this lab crashes into the earth, then the earth will turn to crystal. So yeah, that's the premise of what they have to do, and it's very chaotic, and it's really, really good. If you haven't read the Adventure Zone graphic novels, I cannot recommend them enough. The next movie was Cars, and for that one I needed to read a fast read. I read an arc of the graphic novel / comic Els. This is about Elle, who has these number of different like personalities who are distinguished by different hair colours, and it's hard to explain. I don't think it's supposed to be about DID, which is dissociative identity disorder, where someone is part of a personality system and there's actually different like people within the system who coexist inside one body. I think it's not meant to be about that. If it is, then it is very problematic, I would say. But the vibe I got was it was not about that, and it's actually a sci-fi thing that's happening in the brain, because it seems to be that some kind of experiment has happened or something, and that's actually what's going on there. But I won't be reading any more books in the series to find out, because I only gave it 3 stars. I found it kind of boring. It was okay, but it definitely suffered from first book syndrome, where it wasn't great and it was a lot of setup. And yeah, I just wasn't that intrigued by it. It just was a bit, yeah, it was just a bit bland. The next movie is Brave, and for that one I needed to read a book that had elements of myths or folklore. So I read the comic / graphic novel Hematite, which is about a young vampire and all of her like monster creature friends. So folklore. And it's again another one that I'm not entirely sure what it was about. I think I gave it 3 or 4 stars again because it was drawn incredibly well. I loved the design. I loved the characterization. I loved the color palette. It felt very like historical Victorian era, but the plot confused me. I felt like I was reading the second book in a series because there was no real explanation. It was one of those books where they were trying to throw you in and be like, you'll pick it up as you go, but they never actually explained what was happening as you went. It didn't vibe with me that way, but I thought it was really unique and really creative. And it's one that I would say if you love vampires, werewolves, those kinds of things, it might be one you want to look at because it was a really interesting read. The next movie was Soul, and for that one I needed to read a book with a main character of colour, and for that I read the graphic novel Stealing Home. This is about Japanese internment camps during the Second World War in America. And if you didn't know, what happened was when the Japanese in the war bombed Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans later on were rounded up and sent into these internment camps. The excuse was that they wanted to be able to monitor people, make sure there were no spies, but the conditions were terrible and people really suffered at these camps. But this is about a young family who have to go to this internment camp. And it's about them being split up because the dad was a doctor, but also it's about baseball and how baseball was a huge thing in the internment camps. Because what I didn't know was back at that time there was a Japanese baseball league in America because a lot of the time the Japanese people weren't allowed to play with white people. And so they had their own separate league, but then of course when all of the Japanese were rounded up and sent into internment camps, they all got split up and put into different places, but people still loved baseball, and so they set up their own baseball diamonds, I think they're called, and they created their own baseball teams and played games, and that was something that really brought people together. And yeah, that's basically what it's about, and it's very sad, it's very emotional. It was another 4-star read for me because it is in middle grade, so it was quite simple, but I thought it explained things at a really appropriate level for children. And yeah, I thought it was really well done. I learnt a lot from it, and it was one that I definitely would give to middle grade readers, so like the 9 and 10-year-olds, because I think it really does teach that level of history in a really age-appropriate way without sugarcoating anything and without lying about what happened. And the final movie that I read a book for was Luca. The prompt was to read a book set on or near the sea, and I read A Corpus of Fury by Sarah J Maas. Mostly again by audiobook, although I did read the last few chapters physically. This is my favourite Sarah J Maas book, so of course I rated it 5 stars again. I rated it 5 stars the first time I read it. I won't say how it's set near the sea for people who haven't read ACOTAR yet. I don't want to ruin what happens at the end of ACOTAR, but it is. One of the locations is near the sea. They go to several locations near the sea actually. I love this book. I love Rhys so much. Everyone's all about Cassian and Azriel, but I am all about Rhys. I'm telling you, I'm all about Rhys. I think it's a really, really good book. It is her first book where she starts to lean more towards fantasy romance. The whole of the ACOTAR series is where she's transitioning from fantasy with romance to a fantasy romance series. By the time you get to A Court of Silver Flames, I hear it's gone full-blown fantasy romance, but ACOTAR isn't really fantasy romance. But then ACOMAF is when she really starts to, I don't know, pick up the steaminess. But yeah, I love this. Again, if you haven't read the ACOTAR series, this is your sign. You need to read it. So those are all 12 of the books that I read during August for Pixarathon. I had a really great time. It was a very mixed reading month, and I definitely read a lot of comics and graphic novels because I was feeling kind of burnt out during the month and they were the most accessible thing to me. So yeah, I loved it. I had a really good month and I'm really happy with how Pixarathon went. I loved seeing people's updates. It made me so happy seeing everyone talking about it and taking part. So if you took part, thank you so much. I really loved seeing everything that you guys did. And yeah, I will be back next year, I hope, with another Pixarathon. But for now, that is it for this video. If you liked it, please give it a like and consider subscribing to see more content from me. All of my social media links are in the description below. If you want to leave me a comment to let me know that you are here, leave me a little guitar emoji in the comments below. Thank you again for watching. Bye.